Welcome to Down to Earth Astrology. This is Ms. Jenny and I am your astrologer. Today we are doing a video on Astrology Investigates, Deals Made with the Devil. We are doing some coverage of Bill Cosby and his recent release from prison and Ghislaine Maxwell because, believe it or not, these two things are probably more connected than you realize. Now, I'm no lawyer, but I'm pretty sure that even some of the lawyers around here are shaking their heads going, what the, right? So Bill Cosby has had his conviction for sexual assault, and I believe there were 60 victims, or somewhere in a very, very high number, that were part of this case. And as of July 1st, the Supreme Court of Pennsylvania overturned the conviction based on, ready, charges were invalid because of a prior deal with the prosecutor. Now, I don't know about you. Obviously, I'm not a lawyer, so I probably wouldn't have heard of these things. But if you are a lawyer, I'm pretty sure you might never have heard of these things either. So this is pretty significant and completely unexpected, making all of us shake our heads and scratch our heads, wondering what the hell is going on around here. So, yeah, this is a big WTF moment for everybody, and for people who are victims of sexual assault that have had to deal with the courts and had to deal with law enforcement and all the rigmarole that goes through trying to get your rapist, put behind bars and punished like they're supposed to be, you know that it is already an uphill battle. So this, pulling the linchpin out at the last minute and letting somebody go after they've already been convicted by the Supreme Court, is pretty despairing. So there's got to be a reason why this is happening, right? Well, it doesn't take a rocket scientist to figure out that there may be something afoot that's much bigger than just Bill Cosby. But let's take a look and see what the astrology has to say about this. So what we have in front of us is Bill Cosby's natal chart with the transits that were occurring on July 1st, July 1st, placed around his wheel. Now, what is particularly striking about the chart and the transits and progressions and solar arcs and all of the quadruple, tertiary, quadrutary, pick your abstract mathematical calculation for a chart, going on, is that there's a heavy emphasis on Uranus and Pluto in this chart. So here's the thing, right? Having your conviction overturned is, by anybody's definition, a huge stroke of luck or a great big blessing and favor somebody's done for you. I mean, we're talking this has got to be a good thing, right? There's some beneficence happening here. We generally don't think of something like this as maybe Uranian or plutonium. So the reason is, when we think of Uranus, it could be Uranian because Uranus represents liberation and freedom and sudden shocks and surprises, things that come out of nowhere, and also circumstances, right? So the Uranus emphasis across his chart would make all kinds of sense because this is definitely something coming out of left field. Now, what I would say is that with this heavy emphasis of Uranus, knowing what Uranus means in this chart, with him, and he's taking this as Uranus return also, he may not have even seen this coming. This may be literally something that was engineered behind the scenes without his foreknowledge. And I'm sure he's not going to object to it, so they didn't really need to tell him about it, because nobody's going to say, oh, no, please, by all means, leave me in prison. No one's ever going to have that conversation with an attorney. So there's a lot of Uranus stuff happening. So it's also interesting that he is, in fact, on a Uranus return. And we'll talk about that in a second. Now, Pluto is odd here because we don't think of Pluto when we think of liberation from bondage. We don't think of Pluto when we think of big blessings in disguise and favors and generosity. When we think of Pluto, we think of prison and going to prison and being hurt in prison and all the underworld and criminals and antisocial and psychopathic behaviors that go with Pluto, because Pluto represents all of the deep, buried, ugly sides of ourselves that we don't want to have to look at, right? It's about going underneath the veneer of pretty and nice to see what's really roiling and boiling under the surface. So it's the worms and the bugs and the dirt that makes flowers and vegetables grow in the soil. They're necessary, but you don't see them. And if you were to turn over a rock and actually look at them, you'd be a little frightened or grossed out by what you saw. and that's Pluto. So this is definitely not something we're expecting in this case with an overturned verdict or charge against him. Now, when we look at the Pluto in his chart, if you'll notice, if I can get this to work, yes, the transiting Pluto right here is opposing his Mercury and Pluto. Mercury rules legal documents and communications. Pluto, of course, rules big meta pictures, right? The big picture, the big corporation, anything in huge, large excess. It also rules the underworld and things that are criminal. Criminal lawyers would come out of Mercury, Pluto. And you would definitely need a criminal lawyer if you were in prison for sexual assault. So the midpoint, which is the exact halfway point between Mercury and Pluto, would be 25 degrees. And Pluto is at 25 degrees exact, opposing that. So this transiting Pluto activated this midpoint with that Mercury-Pluto, which could absolutely represent criminal convictions and or his criminal attorney. So that kind of makes sense, but then again, that's still not enough to unburden somebody from their social obligations about staying in prison and serving their time. And especially not on the technicality that we're talking about here. Because we're literally talking about a technicality about some agreement he supposedly made with a prosecutor before he got charged. And how is it, if he made this agreement with a prosecutor before he was charged and convicted, it took them 2 years to figure this out? Now, in theory, I suppose they could have known and had been fighting this and presented that early on through the whole thing, right, as they're pushing it through the system, and it may have taken 2 years to get it up to the Supreme Court. I don't know, but it still seems a little hinky that it wasn't enough of a reason to not charge him and convict him and send him to prison the first time, but now suddenly it's every reason to set a precedent for other cases moving forward and let him go home. I'm just saying, it's a little weird. So the question now becomes, why now? Why now have they suddenly decided to turn everything upside down and backwards and let this guy go, you know, at the possible debility, right, and harm of future victims of sexual assault when it comes to legal cases? So I just want to say here, while we're doing this, here's the thing I want you guys to understand. This video is not about whether he's guilty or not guilty. What this video is specifically about is somebody who's been convicted of a crime that has had their sentence overturned or rejected, like turned backwards, nullified, and has been released from prison on a technicality that wouldn't hold water. Like if you, literally, it just won't hold water anywhere. But apparently suddenly out of the blue it does with the Supreme Court of Pennsylvania. So it's all a little weird because this legal decision sets a precedent for a whole lot of other cases. So this is above and beyond just Bill Cosby. This is about legal precedent moving forward for everybody. So we're not talking about whether he's guilty or not guilty. We're talking about were they thinking, right? I mean, of all the reasons you had to overturn something, this may not have been it. Anyway, so why now, right? So we look at the solar arc and secondary progressions for his chart. We were looking at solar returns. So when we look at the solar arc and secondary secondary progressions, one of the things that we're seeing, again, is a repeating theme. We're seeing Uranus and Pluto very, very strong in the chart, right? So Uranus and Pluto energy or emphasis or experiences are very, very prominently configured in his life right now and are a major factor in why this decision was made. Now, with that said, at the same time, remember we've got this Pluto thing going on. Well, Pluto is involving his Jupiter, which is also involving the Sun, Mercury, Pluto down here. So he is, in fact, getting a lucky break, obviously. However, again, there's a lot more going on here. So he's getting a lucky break on a technicality, which may have more to do with a bigger picture or plan than just him. So he may actually be the lucky recipient of being in the right place at the right time in this instance and being a pawn for a bigger game involving other people. And just to make sure I'm not losing my mind, I went and pulled up a tertiary progression, and again, same thing, we're getting this huge emphasis of Uranus. In this case, Uranus is on the tertiary ascendant, right? We've got transiting Uranus right here on Jupiter, Saturn in his tertiary chart, and we've got Uranus and Pluto again right? Pluto's there involving all of this. And I'm not going to get into like a whole lot of explanation about how to read the Tartary chart or what these things specifically mean, because we don't have enough time for that. And ultimately what we're looking for are repeating dominant themes through the chart. It's one thing to see an aspect one time, but you want to see like a layer cake. You want to see layers upon layers upon layers, like a repeating themes that are emphasizing something. So the more things that we have coming together and coalescing that are repeating or echoing the same energy or experience or themes, you know, the more likely we are to have that particular thing snap into existence and become reality. So an isolated aspect or by transit or in a natal chart is not enough. We need to see multiple things confirming and reinforcing that this particular thing is the dominant thing that we're dealing with. And with Bill Cosby, again, Uranus and Pluto with a little bit of Jupiter thrown in, but ultimately Uranus and Pluto is what really was driving this train. So consider also, right, because he is on Uranus return, consider also that at this time he's being released, he is 83 years old. An 83-year-old man in prison is not going to fare well. Even if the 83-year-old man is considered the, you know, the, what is it, the father of America, right? America's best dad. Because everybody has really fond memories of Bill Cosby as an entertainer and as a TV show personality. Like, we've all got really fond memories of him, which makes the whole court case around him very complicated because, you know, our heroes are not supposed to have clay feet. But, and I say that because even in prison, these are people who have had very difficult lives. I mean, a lot of these people end up the way they do, not by accident, but because of environment and conditioning and bad breaks and a whole lot of other stuff that contribute to ending up in prison. I mean, this is not something people aspire to, or at least we would hope that's not something they aspire to. But even these people who are out on the fringes of society or have the most difficulty connecting socially and emotionally with other people in healthy, non-toxic ways, may still have very strong memories of Bill Cosby as the entertainer, you know, or the personality on TV, and that will give him some leeway and protection, you know, in this population, but it won't protect him from everything and everyone, right? Because at the end of the day, it's still prison, which is basically a giant animal farm, right, of the worst variety. And this is a prison cell. This is what a prison cell looks like. And when we talk about Uranus and Pluto, these are the kinds of things that we can expect as not unusual for Uranus-Pluto expressions, especially in prison. The thing to remember about Uranus is that Uranus is not a delicate, fluffy planet. Uranus, the god, ate his children, for God's sakes. So Uranus is also has a propensity towards violence and antisocial behavior. And I'm going to move this image on so you don't have to keep staring at it. So Uranus has a propensity to violence and shock and antisocial behavior, just as, because it's a transpersonal planet, just as it has the capacity for transcendence and ingeniousness and genius and all of the wonderful, and science and technology and inventiveness, all the wonderful things that go with Uranus. So one of the reasons we don't talk a lot about the underbelly of Uranus is because Western astrology, especially these days, because it's very mass market, we like to make it appealing and attractive. So we like to make it simple as possible. So what happens is when you're making astrology simple, and certainly simple enough for a simpleton to understand, you are assigning very limited, obvious definitions to things. So every planet has its role and character and archetype, and we like to leave it like that. We don't like things that get complicated and messy because that gets confusing for people. So for instance, Uranus having both phenomenally good and phenomenally bad characteristics can be confusing for some people when they're learning astrology. So for the most part, with modern astrology and the way it's taught, we tend to leave out a lot of stuff because, you know, and honestly, let's be honest, people have the attention span of gnats. So most people aren't trying that hard to really understand what they're doing or reading or interpreting. They just want enough of the high points to go be able to impress their friends and, you know, spy with the stars on their lovers. So Uranus can be a violent planet. Uranus can also be difficult in its relationship to children. This does not mean, by the way, that Uranians are prone to child abuse or being child abusers. It is to say that Uranus is not fundamentally designed to withstand the rigors of parenting with small children. It's a very special quality and set of skills that an adult has to have to be able to deal with infants and small children and youth. It's a whole, like, it's a skill set, and it's a demeanor and a personality type, and it's a whole set of things that a person has to have wired into them to make that job easier for them. If you're not naturally wired that way, contrary to the Lifetime movies, you will not suddenly become a different person because a child has been hoisted upon you. Okay, it doesn't work like that. It's only in fairy tales does the Scrooge suddenly develop a heart at the end, right, and become a different person. You will always be who you are. The difference is something's going to be easier for you to do and something's going to be more challenging for you to do. With Uranians, like with this propensity to be erratic in their energy expression and impatient, and also tending to think faster than they can speak or move, these are not things that are conducive to optimal childhoods for other people. So Uranians can be challenging when it comes to raising children. They're better with teenagers and young adults, but really small kids can be a bit of a challenge only because of their own energy regulation issues. So anyway, that's a little sidebar. There's a whole lot of stuff that goes with Uranus that's not just genius, right? Ooh, you're a genius. You know, or being a weirdo or anything like that. There's a whole lot more. And also Pluto. So here's the thing, right? With Uranus and Pluto being an 83-year-old man with heavy, hard Uranus-Pluto emphasis across all his charts by transit to his natal, by tertiary and secondary and solar progression. Like literally this theme is echoing through all these variations of his chart. When that is happening, it is entirely possible that violence visited upon him was a very real possibility. And while we're not necessarily going to get the courts to turn their decisions or their hearts for, you know, general principle, I suppose, they're not all of them are lacking compassion. So it is entirely possible that Bill Cosby was under threat of serious or significant violence. And he was actually safer being moved out of prison, because what is the option? Putting him in isolation, putting him in a medical ward? Like, how long can you do that? And just letting him go. And also remember, the man is 83 years old. So at this point, the compassionate thing might have been, given these circumstances, if violence was an issue, like real genuine threats of violence and death were an issue, releasing him from prison so he can, you know, go home might have been the more acceptable compromise in this particular instance. And that may have been part of what's driving this. I think there are other things factored into this. So I think the fulcrum that forced this issue, right, the trigger or that catalyzed this, the thing that catalyzed this was, or possibly could have been, the threat of violence from inside the prison. And that was used to create the urgency necessary to get him out. And it just happened to be with this Uranus-Pluto stuff happening. So that's just my suspicion. I'm just saying. So with all that said, he's out, you know, and I hope he enjoys his freedom for as long as he has it. He is 83 and is under some major Uranus-Pluto aspects. So we'll see. We'll see what happens over the next 6 months or to a year. In any event, days to watch for him coming up immediately are going to be the end of September, early October. As a matter of fact, the first week of October, we've got a Pluto station that will absolutely be affecting his chart or impacting his chart. And if he gets through that successfully, then we're looking, the next set of significant dates for him will be January 2022. So what does any of this have to do with Ghislaine Maxwell, and why do we care, right? I mean, he's an old guy, he's almost 100 years old, let him go home, right? Well, the reason we care is because, one, the Supreme Court is the highest court in the land. The only person or bodies that can overturn a Supreme Court decision is the Supreme Court. Remember, these are lifetime appointments. So if the Supreme Court judges make a decision, literally people have to die off and have their seat on the bench replaced before you have anybody with a different perception or opinion or mindset that would even consider reversing a decision they've already made. That's, you know, some of the handicap of a Supreme Court appointment. They're lifetime appointments. So if you get, like we have now in the federal Supreme Court, Tweedledee and Tweedledum, Kavanaugh and what's-her-face, right? The one that looks like the villainess out of Harry Potter with all the kittens on the saucers. Can't remember their name. Anyway, with these two wackadoodles, right, Tweedledee and Tweedledum, with those two on the Supreme Court, unless they die, whatever decision they make, or they're in the majority of making, like literally you would have to have other people in that Supreme Court group that we have in federal government right now, they would literally have to die first, like, bless her heart, Ruth Bader Ginsburg did, to be replaced by other people. Amy Barrett, that's what her name is. So with Bill Cosby, even though this is the state, not the federal, it is still the Supreme Court. These are still lifetime appointments, which means that this decision may never get overturned. Now, here's why this matters. When they do stuff like this, in law, in all cases of law, to my knowledge, they're always making their case based on precedent, meaning what did somebody do before this in a similar case? You know, in a similar case and a similar charge, how did they decide and what was their logic to come to this decision? That's typically how they build their verdicts or decide what they're going to do. So very rarely do they veer from precedent. And when they do, they set a new precedent, which now becomes the thing that all people after that day or that case will refer back to make their decisions. This means that when it comes to sexual assault cases, because the state of Pennsylvania and their Supreme Court, in their infinite short-sighted wisdom, decided to overturn this based on some agreement supposedly made with a prosecutor before he went to trial, 2 years after the fact, right? This same thing can be used to try and overturn or throw out sexual assault cases in the future. And this is where Ghislaine Maxwell comes in. So here is Ghislaine Maxwell's chart. Now, we all know the story with her, and we also know she's got a whole lot of information she's not getting up off of. So at the time of this verdict coming down with Bill Cosby, we looked at the chart for her, because does it affect her? I mean, her lawyers are certainly chomping at the bit, like looking for an opportunity to use this to spring her from jail. So looking at Ghislaine Maxwell's chart, here's what we got, right? So this transiting Uranus, this Uranus that is Bill Cosby's Uranus return, that is part of the whole Uranus-Pluto configuration he's working with right now, it absolutely pulls in her chart as well. Now, she, by nature, originally, let me find a better color for this. No. So she carries a T-square, right? So she's got this moon opposed Jupiter, and it's all squaring Neptune. So we know she's a, she's a shady lady. We know that she lives in her own little world. She's literally floating around on Fantasy Island in her head. And that's just how we do around these parts. Now, transiting Uranus right here sets up a grand cross to that chart. So of course, with Uranus, this transiting Uranus, pulling in that T-square, completing it and making it a grand cross in her chart, you can imagine that her optimism is over the damn moon right now, because I'm sure she's convinced herself that this is her get out of jail free card. And maybe it is, maybe it isn't. We're not really sure how this is going to play out. And there's all kinds of fishy stuff going on here that we want to keep an eye on. Now, what's interesting about this transiting Uranus is that Ghislaine naturally carries Sirius at 12 Taurus. So she originally has, use this one, a grand cross involving the moon and Jupiter and Neptune and Sirius. So in theory, one could say that she presents herself in this lifetime as not necessarily a benefactor, but a bit of a mother figure, right? Which is what we've also been hearing about from these victims of Jeffrey Epstein. But more than that, I mean, and it wouldn't just be with them, though, it would be with all of her friends. So she would present herself and operate in a way that makes her a bit of a nurturer or a confidant, you know, the go-to person when you need understanding, sympathy, and support and explanation about things. So with her, and also with Jupiter involved here, as well as Neptune and the Moon, there's also a bit of an educator in her as well. So it would be interesting to see or to know what it is that she educated people on outside of the Jeffrey Epstein harem. So here's what I'm saying. So this year, transiting Uranus is actually conjuncting Sirius, which is part of this Grand Cross. So my suspicion, now listen, I could be completely wrong, but my suspicion is that this Uranus is indicative of some type of windfall or assistance or out of the blue support or unlocking of a key coming from a woman, because it's Sirius and the Moon, right? And also, this would have everything to do with her employer, which in this case would be Jeffrey Epstein. So, I mean, unless she's got a different employer I don't know about, right? So it is entirely possible that Ms. Maxwell is getting or looking at being the recipient of favors or protection or support or some type of liberation, Uranus's liberation, as facilitated by a woman who is associated with her through higher social groups or an employer. So this is either somebody from the Jeffrey Epstein crowd, or this is a woman that she knows that's of significant social status. And why she would want to help this woman is beyond me, but you know, everybody's got their secrets, right? Here's the problem though, Neptune is involved. We've got a Grand Cross involving Neptune and Jupiter. So her optimism, while huge at this time, and certainly blowing up to the stars, may be completely misplaced. It may not pan out the way she's dreaming it will. This December, we've got an eclipse at 12 Sagittarius. Now this eclipse at 12 Sagittarius, so we're going to watch her chart this December, is going to be right here, almost dead on her 7th house. So come December, we should see her back in the public eye, and also we should definitely be seeing things that reveal who her real opponents or allies are. So everybody's got to pick a side at this point, and it'll be really obvious who is on the playing field with her. So we'll see about that, which also makes me wonder if this benefactor, whoever this is, that's bringing this windfall of luck to her, is not also part of a small group of people orchestrating Bill Cosby's release under, you know, because he's 83, there's violence, that's the least we can do, yada, yada, yada. Knowing that him being released on this kind of technicality would set a precedent for everyone after he was released, which would include her. Because the thing about it, remember too, is that people typically, when they do stuff like that, they don't think about everybody else after that that's involved. They don't care. They're very selfish. So they only see as far as what they need to do to get what they need to get done, and anything after that is somebody else's problem. So if this were the case, whoever's responsible for this would not give a rat's behind about all of the other people after Ghislaine Maxwell that would utilize this loophole or this precedent, you know, to get themselves out of prison, you know, or out of charges, you know, and how this affects other sexual assault survivors. Literally, it would just be about what they need right now, which would be to get Ghislaine out of jail. So this is a really fast video. So here are the dates we want to watch for Ghislaine Maxwell. Also to remember that if they are in fact effective in making this work, it will not happen overnight. So Ghislaine will not get out of jail tomorrow. So she won't be out of jail by December, although she certainly will probably be back in court, like visible up front and contesting this in December. The dates we want to watch for her are going to be March 10th of next year, March 17th through 20th specifically, because she's got a lot of Jupiter activation going on. It is entirely possible that she could get sprung from jail next March. Now her chart ruler is at 8 Capricorn, and Pluto will be at 12 Virgo in one of the charts, and I don't remember which. I'm so sorry. No. She has a natal Pluto at 12 Virgo. Listen to me. Jesus Lord. So her chart, she's Gemini rising, which makes her chart ruler Capricorn, 8 degrees Capricorn. Her natal Pluto is in Virgo, and together with the April 2002 eclipse at 10 Taurus, this makes a grand trine. So all of this Jupiter activation in March goes down into April, because that was sort of a grand trine in houses 5, 8, and 12. Now, here's what I would say about all of this, right? So even though there's a distinct possibility she might actually get out of prison by then, because someone is assisting in the orchestration of creating legal precedents and loopholes to get her out, because she has enough information that the last thing they need is her squealing. And the minute she honestly believes that no one is coming to rescue her is when she'll start talking, right? Which may be why she's been so suspiciously quiet all the time. Like, she's been really quiet for somebody who's in a really bad way. So she must have known that they were working on something, which is the only thing that makes sense with this Bill Cosby conviction or being overturned. Nothing else, and it's the Supreme Court. Nothing else makes sense, but now it does, because that precedent, that legal maneuver and standing by the Supreme Court, can be used as precedent for her. And like I said already, the lawyers are chomping at the bit trying to get this back into the courts so they can overturn her conviction. So whoever she's got dirt on, all of them, some of them, one of them, there's somebody there, I would imagine, and I'm guessing, but it would make all kinds of sense. I would imagine that somebody or a handful of people has a very strong interest in keeping her quiet and docile and happy, and not spilling the beans. And I suspect that this is a woman. There is a woman behind these manipulations and orchestrations. Now, whether we find out about it or not, I don't know. So here's the thing, though, right? And I know this is starting to go into like all kinds of conspiracy theory land. And you know, I'm not a fan of conspiracy theories, so bear with me for a second. If it were you, right? So imagine this: if this were you and you had a lot of money and power and influence, and the last thing you need is to be exposed for being involved with the likes of Jeffrey Epstein and his shenanigans, right? You know, because you don't need to be seen as a serial predator of children either, right? So imagine, or maybe it's not you, maybe it's one of your kids, right? Maybe it's somebody in your family. But it, you know, listen, mud splashes everywhere, right? So even if you could get her out, here's the thing. Even if you could get her out, the problem is, as long as this woman is alive and talking, she is still a monumental breach of security risk. She still has the ability to spill the beans and get a whole lot of people in trouble. So it's not about being blackmailed as much as she just represents a huge risk, because at any given time she could open her mouth and expose the very things you've been trying to keep undercover, and that's why you went through all this to spring her from prison in the first place. So if that's the case, obviously, like, she needs to be taken care of. So getting her out of prison is only one half of an equation here. I'm going to finish up that thought in a second. Now, here is, again, we're looking for themes, right? So here is the progressions and solar arcs for that week around March 17th of next year, when I suspect if she gets out, she'll get out. So the whole month of March is very, very active for her. In this particular instance, we have Uranus here, right, which is, again, so this is still active, right, this giant grand cross in her chart. One of the things that I noticed, though, is if you look, she's got all this Chiron activation, right? She's got Mars across that Chiron, Sun Chiron. She's got a lot of Chiron activation in her chart. Now, Chiron is a bit of a handicapper, and it can be problematic. But all of this is to say is that there's nothing in the nature of Chiron that describes liberation. So it's not Jupiter and it's not Uranus. It's not the same thing as Bill Cosby when Bill Cosby was released. So Uranus and Jupiter both are planets of liberation, because they're well, yeah, I mean, they're moksha planets, right? Chiron is not. So she's got a lot of Chiron activation here, but Chiron has nothing to do with liberation or beneficence or protection or good luck or any of those things. But it's there around this March episode when she's got all this Jupiter activation happening in her chart separately. Now here we've got all this Jupiter stuff happening, right? But it's Jupiter and it's involving her Neptune, you know, and it's part of that Grand Cross. So, you know, even though it's technically very lucky, it's also very messy. So I'm not completely sure that whatever she's getting is going to be what she's hoping it will be. So even if she gets out of prison, this will not go the way she's expecting it to. And just for good measure, I pulled a tertiary chart from March 17th. Now, with these solar arc progression and tertiary charts, they take time to move. So these planets, as they're lining up, will not change position like within a day. So these are good for a couple of days. So in the tertiary chart, we've got a lot of emphasis on that 7th house, which is the house of partnerships, and also enemies, public, open, declared enemies, not enemies that you don't know about, but enemies who make their presence known. You know who they are. So Mars by transit will be going across that descendant, her natal Jupiter. This descendant tertiary is coming to her natal Jupiter. Mercury and Saturn by progression are also coming up here. We've got a lot of activity going on with her 7th house of open enemies and also legal stuff around March 17th. Now this could, in theory, just mean that she's being removed from prison. But I suspect there are more things afoot here, and this is going to be a little bit more complicated than she thinks it is. She's not just going to walk skipping out of the jailhouse like Cosby did. So, with all of that said, if I were in a position that I could call in a few favors here and there and orchestrate threats of significant violence to an 83-year-old man who's very much loved by, the country, because of what we remember of him as a personality and an entertainer, right? And I could do that in a way to create urgency or gravity behind the need to remove him from prison, even if we've got to create a legal loophole by using some tiny agreement that may or may not have happened with a prosecutor before he got charged 2 years ago, to create a legal precedent on which we're now going to pole vault forward into the Ghislaine Maxwell trial to try and spring her from prison, right? If I had that kind of power and influence, that I could call in a few favors to make that happen, it means that I've got certainly a lot to protect, that Ghislaine Maxwell, I cannot afford to have her telling people about, right? I cannot afford to have her running her mouth about my involvement in whatever this is that has me orchestrating this behind the scenes. What that also means for any thinking person, right, is that once this girl gets out, she's still a liability. She is still a liability because she may be free from prison and she may know, or I may tell her eventually, that she owes me for this. But there's a really good chance that I'm not going to tell her I was responsible for it because I don't need my name in her mouth. And what that also means is that if I were to, remove her from the face of the planet, it's going to be a lot easier to do when she's outside of prison and it's a much less controlled environment. And who's going to know? Who's going to know, right? So if I were Ghislaine Maxwell, honestly, I would reconsider ever leaving prison again, because she's actually probably safer in prison than she is out on the street. But, she is the eternal optimist, and she lives in her own little fantasy island in her head, and I'm sure not sleeping on 200-count Egyptian sheets or cotton sheets or whatever she's accustomed to sleeping on is a real torture for her. So anything that gets her out of there to what she believes is going to be getting her old life back is infinitely better than continuing to stay there. So she will leap at the chance to get out of prison. Unfortunately, it's literally, I think, going to be a case of jumping from the frying pan into the fire. So she may not, I hate to say it, but she may not last that long once she's outside of prison. Because even if none of this happens, even if she walks around perfectly fine and, without, scary people in trench coats and dark glasses lurking about the shadows behind her at every step, even if that doesn't happen, the fact of the matter is her name is mud. Literally, no one's going to have anything to do with her at this point because she is, like Trump, she has become poison. So, with no actual skills and no one who's going to be willing to do business with her, it will be very difficult for her to get anything even close to the life she had before. So, and of course, her assets are all tied up because I think she was suing the Epstein estate because her money was tied up in it, or it was supposed to go to her and they won't give it to her. It's, it's not good. It's not good. But so we'll see. I think these things are connected. I could be wrong. And again, I'm not a huge fan of conspiracy theories, but this whole, what the hell just happened with Cosby really got the wheels turning because it's like, this doesn't make sense on the best of days. So there you go. And remember, folks, don't count your chickens before they hatch because they might not turn out to be chickens. So support the channel and keep the dream alive. If you enjoyed this, and thank you for watching, by the way, hit the like button, or hey, even better, give me a comment. Make sure you subscribe so you get notifications of future videos. And if you really want to keep somebody entertained, you can share this with them. All right, and see you at the next video.